The first great loss after a leg is the ability to write. It is like struggling with a heavy rubber tie hanging from your neck. Don't ask me why. All I know is the hopeless great weight crushing your arms. As you see, my handwriting is shot to hell too. A typewriter is simply out of the question. Welcome back to Dust on the Road. So when we last left off, we'd heard about the third Bandini novel, Ask the Dust, and its subsequent publication in the late 1930s, its disappearance, and eventual re-emergence. Across the 1970s and 80s, the work of John Fante underwent something of a renaissance. In 1975, Fante actually had a new novel not featuring Bandini, The Brotherhood of the Grape, published. Fante's son Dan mentions in his memoir that his dad, quote, was delighted at the prospect of being back in print. For years, my father had cursed publishers and doubted himself and faced consistent failure as an author. Because he was no longer an A-list screenwriter and lacked the distraction of hustling for movie deals, he had gained the ability to focus on what he did best. His diabetes had worsened, and he now limped badly and was losing the vision in his only good eye, but that did not minimise his pleasure at the prospect of having a new book on bookstore shelves. This means it was no surprise that, with the renewed interest in John Fante that came with the intervention of Charles Bukowski and Black Sparrow Press, that Fante decided to take Arturo Bandini out for one final spin. However, as you've just heard, by the time this opportunity arrived, Fante's circumstances had changed pretty dramatically. In the 1950s, Fante had another book published. It was called Full of Life, and the book featured, as its main character, John Fante. Fante wrote that, quote, I must admit that I made one rather embarrassing compromise along the way. The book is fiction, pure and simple. Little Brown, the publisher, felt that as fiction it would not sell. They wondered if I would object to using my own name for the hero. I went along. Now, by virtue of this absurd change in names, the book is no longer fiction, but fact. As a result, people thought this was an autobiographical novel, when in fact it was an overly sentimental retelling of his life that, in reality, did not reflect his home life at that time at all. Columbia Pictures acquired the rights for the screenplay, and the film, in which the main character is called Nick Rocco rather than John Fante, was a tremendous commercial success, further cementing Fante's relative financial comfort. The other major event of the 1950s is the fact that in 1955, John Fante was diagnosed with diabetes. By the 1970s, a diabetic ulcer between his toes had begun causing him such pain that he was struggling to walk. More lesions on his feet appeared and his eyesight began to deteriorate. Soon, circulation to his lower legs wasn't what it should be, and the pain was pretty much unbearable. Fante was checked into hospital where he had a toe on each foot amputated. A month later, one of his feet was black with gangrene. His left leg was amputated below the knee, and later the remains of that same leg were amputated too. In addition to this, after multiple operations on his eyes to improve his sight, John Fante went completely blind. However, with the renewed interest in his work, nothing was going to stop the last ride of Arturo Bandini. The final Bandini novel, originally called How to Write a Screenplay, was, by the time of publication in March 1982, released under the title Dreams from Bunker Hill. A major influence on the new novel, as always, was to be Knut Hamsun, and his novel Hunger in particular. You might remember that the title Ask the Dust comes from Hamsun, and in fact, on the final page of this last Bandini novel, Arturo Bandini pulls out his copy of Hunger, quote, a treasured piece, constantly with me since the day I stole it from the Boulder Library. I had read it so many times I could recite it. According to the John Fante literary portrait, Fante's daughter said that Fante kept his personal copy of Hunger locked away. She and her brothers, quote, knew what it was because they heard their father talk about it, but it was a household taboo, not to be read by anyone, nor even to be touched by any but their father's hands. Throughout the previous episodes of this podcast, I've occasionally pulled quotes from the Fante tapes, Ben Pleasant's interviews with John Fante, which are available in full online at 3am magazine. The interviews took place between December 1978 and Fante's death in 1983. The reason these have been particularly helpful for this episode is that it's the first instance we have of Fante being interviewed while actually working on a Bandini novel. While I'll be pulling a few key quotes for this episode, I would recommend you check out the entire interviews online if you do have the time. In terms of Dreams from Bunker Hill, Fante told Pleasance that he was, quote, working on a book now that I'm dictating to my wife. It's difficult for me because I have to keep everything in my head, and I sometimes forget. But I've never been so finicky as I am now. With my blindness has come a certain determination to be much more accurate than I used to be. He said, quote, it's the story of a writer who comes out here from Colorado and has no thought of becoming a screenwriter. He comes out because he wants to be a writer and get away from home, and he more or less falls into screenwriting. It'll be a short novel. It all depends on how it develops. It's very easy to write. That's the difficulty with it. It's like quicksand, you know. You go plunging in and before you know it, you're in over your head and you're down a path that you don't want to go down. Of course, Fante's health and physical capabilities had changed massively since the days of writing, say, Ask the Dust. However, after completing the manuscript for Dreams from Bunker Hill, Fante told Pleasance that it hadn't quite been the major hurdle it might seem. It didn't bother me any, he said. Naturally, I missed my sight and regretted not having it, but I wasn't depressed about it. I was philosophical. Besides, Fante and his wife Joyce had come up with a pretty good workaround. I dictated it to Joyce, he explained. She put it down in longhand and then typed it out, and there it was. Joyce wrote to a friend that she now had, quote, the unique opportunity to observe the making of a novel. She later said that she, quote, was delighted he was doing it, and I loved the material, and I was very enthusiastic. I wasn't quite sure how to set out fiction because I'd never written fiction, but I looked at John's previous work, saw how he did it, and tried to set it up as close as possible to his style, as to paragraph breaks and so on. John would tell me when he wanted to make a paragraph and when he wanted a chapter break. John's way of working is highly individual, I think, she said, because he does most of his work before he begins to write, so to speak, and he knows exactly what it's going to be like before he starts to dictate. As Joyce wrote to a friend, quote, John's work is his life. It literally keeps him alive. He's not satisfied until a passage is right. He is part master craftsman and part instinctive artist. Fante called the novel, quote, a black comedy, scandalous, grotesque, bizarre. I can only imagine that in part the reason this novel came with such ease for him was because it was, as Fante said, quote, basically autobiographical. Fante told Ben Pleasance that Dreams from Bunker Hill covers the period of a couple of years in his life, and between them they estimate that Ask the Dust probably covers the period of Fante's life in 1931, and from this Ben Pleasance estimates that Dreams from Bunker Hill covers roughly the period of 1932 to 1933. The proximity and overlap of the two books seemed to cause some confusion with Chinatown director Robert Towne, who was still trying to get his Ask the Dust movie project off the ground. Fante said, quote, Towne is mad at me because the section of Dreams from Bunker Hill seems to cover the same period as Ask the Dust. In Ask the Dust there was no mention at all of ever working in the studios, whereas in Dreams from Bunker Hill that was its main concern. They're actually quite separate books. My first collision with fame was hardly memorable. So begins the final Bandini novel. The year is 1934. Bandini is 21. He is a busboy and a writer. The Los Angeles Times runs a story on this young writer. Quote, an ambitious, hard-working kid from Colorado who had crashed through the difficult magazine world with the sale of his first story. The story was, quote, edited, of course, by the most renowned personage in American literature, none other than Heinrich Müller. Good old Müller. How I loved that man. By this point, I imagine you've worked out that this is another reference to H.L. Mencken, who played such a significant role in Fante's writing career. In Ask the Dust, he was Hackmuth. Here, he is Müller. By this point, Mencken had long since passed away. The pair didn't exchange letters at all during the 1940s. However, in the 1950s, when Fante read of Mencken's deteriorating health, he wrote a letter to Mencken's assistant asking if there was anything he could do to help, even if that meant sending some music he might like so he had something to listen to. So it is no surprise that here, another 20 years later, Fante still wanted to pay one last tribute to his mentor. A literary agent leaves his business card for Bandini, and Bandini visits his office. The agent is looking for an editor of, quote, novels, short stories, whatever comes in. It's awful, he adds. They're all awful. I can't read them anymore. It's the worst writing I ever saw, but there's money in it if you've got the stomach. This is, once again, a different Arturo Bandini. He differs from, say, the crab-killing Bandini of The Road to Los Angeles in that, rather than torment animals, he cares for them. When he spots 3 cats on the windowsill of his office, he, quote, couldn't take it. I went down the elevator to the deli and found some slices of pastrami in the garbage can. I wrapped them in a napkin and brought them back to the cats. I don't know if it's a coincidence that in the novel where Fante writes about his experiences of moving on to writing screenplays, he literally has Bandini save the cat, one of the most common and referenced screenwriting rules in the very first chapter. However, this isn't a totally different character. He's still Bandini. He's still obsessed with women, and frankly, at times a creep. When he's introduced to Jennifer Lovelace to work on a manuscript with her, he uses the excess cat fur on her dress as an excuse to pat her excessively. Later, when he gets back to his hotel, he realises his neighbour is a prostitute. She invites him in, but he feels unable to sleep with her. After he leaves her room, he thanks God in classic melodramatic Bandini style. "Oh, blessed infant Jesus," he prays, "thank you for saving me this day. Bless you for the surge of God's goodness that moved me from that room of sin. I swear it now, I will never sin again." Of course, ever consistent, by the end of the next chapter, Bandini is knocking at her door again. Bandini again only uses his religious roots when it suits him. He tries to bluff a religious enthusiasm when talking with Jennifer Lovelace. Later, he blows his cover and his chances of working with her in person on a manuscript when he throws himself at her. Quote, "You've got nothing to lose, everything to gain. I stood up and flung myself at her, falling to my knees and throwing my arms around her waist." They explode into a fight. Lovelace calls him crazy, a son of a bitch, and Bandini says it's, quote, "the end of the world, the end of me, the end of my love." After inevitably losing the writing job, Bandini goes to see the performer Ginger Britton and decides he is in love again. He writes her a letter where he says, quote, "I love you madly, I reverence you, I long to know you, to talk to you, to hold your hand, to take you in my arms and smother you with kisses." He puts the letter in an envelope and takes it to the lobby of his hotel, to his landlord, the 55-year-old Helen Brownell. She offers him a piece of pie and Bandini feels she is finally softening towards him. They get drunk together and Bandini wakes up in bed with her. During the 1930s, Fante lived on and off with a music teacher, Helen Purcell, who was 10 years his senior, who I can only assume became the basis for Helen Brownell here. Bandini and Brownell embark on a kind of affair together. Bandini gets a new Hollywood writing job and it pays well. As for the work itself, Bandini describes it as, quote, "an unfathomable mystery. I spent the days reading screenplays, a dozen of them, one a day, none of which I cared for." The saving grace, aside from the money, is his budding friendship with his colleague Frank Edgington, who helps Bandini settle into the role. Meanwhile, Helen mainly just loves that Bandini can afford to take her out to expensive places. "It's so nice to be with a famous writer," she says. Then, on one particular date night, when Bandini has decided they are going to go to the Coconut Grove to hear the music of Anson Weeks, the waiter serves their food and assumes Helen is Bandini's mother. Bandini, trying to lighten the mood, says, "Shall we dance, mother dear?" which only upsets her more, and she runs off. Later, alone in his room, Bandini, quote, "opened a suitcase and dumped my things into it. I didn't want to go, but there was no denying it. I had somehow blundered and kicked myself out, and there was no turning back. Goodbye to Bunker Hill." After crashing with his new friend Frank Edgington, an arrangement which ends with Bandini punching Frank in the face, and a stay near the beach where he briefly befriends the wrestling Duke of Sardinia, Bandini is left with no choice. Quote, "I hate this place, this friendless city. Why was it always thrusting me away like an unwanted orphan? So fuck you, Los Angeles," he says, inverting the most famous passage of Ask the Dust. "Fuck your palm trees and your fancy streets, for I am going home, back to Colorado, back to the best damn town in the USA, Boulder, Colorado." In Boulder, Bandini bumps into his father almost immediately, who asks him why he's come home. "I wanted to, I had to," Bandini says. "There's nothing for you here," his father replies. "What are you going to do now?" "I'll think of something," Bandini says. "You won't listen to me," his father says. "You never did listen to your father." While Bandini here is obviously on good enough terms with his family to be able to return home, it's clear the friction from his younger days is still and ever present. Still, Bandini has fond memories of his childhood home. Quote, "What a wonderful street. How much of my life I had spent here under the quiet elms, our house a block away. Christmases and baseball and First Communion and Halloween, and kites and sleigh rides and ball games and Easter and graduation, and all of my life evoked by this wondrous street of old houses, with dim lights in windows, and home at the end of the block." This home has his mother, his father, still alive, a younger sister, Stella, and a little brother, Tom. Bandini hands his mother $200 and she begins to cry. The family then quizzes him on various famous movie stars and Bandini declares that every single one is a good friend. He revisits the local library and, quote, "found again the books that changed my life. Sherwood Anderson, Jack London, Knut Hamsun, Dostoevsky. The welcome they gave me was much warmer than the cold curiosity of old friends I met in town." Bandini is invited to a party by a local wealthy girl, and his mother is delighted at the invite, telling Bandini she is so proud that he has made something of himself. Bandini reluctantly attends, and a girl approaches him and says, "I hear you're a screenwriter." "Best in Hollywood," Bandini replies. "I knew you'd say something like that," she says. "Are you still writing that miserable poetry?" Bandini, wounded, starts bragging about how much money he earns, his connections, his relationship with Ginger Rogers and his playing golf with Bing Crosby. "Everybody loves me," he says. "Understand? Everybody." When people begin laughing at him, Bandini starts a fight. He sneaks back home and decides to leave town again. He gets his brother Tom to drive him to the bus depot and heads back to Los Angeles. Bandini has only one plan in mind, quote, "I would walk to the top of Bunker Hill and open my arms and say, 'Helen, I love you.' We would start over again. Maybe we'd buy a little house in Woodland Hills, the Kansas type, with a chicken yard and a dog." Back in Los Angeles, Bandini, quote, "looked at the hotel in the distance. It was magic, like a castle in a book of fairy tales. I knew she would have me this time." Upon reaching the hotel, he meets Helen's brother and finds out that Helen has passed away from a stroke. Bandini, desolate, returns to his old room in the hotel he stayed at when he first left Helen. His old room is still vacant, quote, the most uninviting room in Los Angeles. Miraculously, his old typewriter is still there too. Quote, I opened a suitcase and took out a copy of Knut Hamsun's Hunger. It was a treasured piece, constantly with me since the day I stole it from the Boulder Library. I went to the typewriter and sat before it. My thought was to write a sentence, a single, perfect sentence. If I could write one good sentence, I could write two, and if I could write two, I could write three, and if I could write three, I could write forever. I had $17 and the fear of writing. I sat erect before the typewriter and blew on my fingers. Please, God, please, Knut Hamsun, don't desert me now. I started to write, and I wrote, The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. I looked at it and wet my lips. It wasn't mine, but what the hell, a man had to start someplace. And with that, we part ways with Arturo Bandini for good. John Fante passed away on May 8th, 1983. After his death, his novels continued to be widely published, translated into multiple languages, and read all around the world. In 1987, he was recognised with a posthumous PEN Lifetime Achievement Award. And on April 8th, 2010, on what would have been his 101st birthday, the city of Los Angeles officially named the intersection of 5th and Grand Streets John Fante Square. At the unveiling event, Councilwoman Jan Perry said that, quote, John Fante was a beloved downtown Los Angeles writer who told the story of living in Bunker Hill, sharing both the difficulties and the beauty of calling this area home. Fante biographer Stephen Cooper spoke, telling the gathered crowd that, quote, in the early 1930s, the young John Fante lived at the Alta Vista Hotel, starving for love, dreaming of writing the greatest novel ever written. As outrageous as that dream might strike us, some think he succeeded. Nobody has been more enthusiastic about embracing Fante's vision than young readers and writers, who recognise the tragic comic truths that his fiction tells us about family, faith, loneliness, poverty, racism, and the power of youthful desire, about the places inside and out. Fante's daughter Vicky read from Ask the Dust. His son Jim said, Dad, that sad flower in the sand, Los Angeles, has finally come to you. And the last of the children to speak, his son Dan, read a pair of poems about John Fante, ending with the lines, a man who once had such power, whose words held so much beauty, that the sky itself was increased by 1 billion stars.